Scott Mann, super stoked to have you here. Thanks for joining me on the Mark Divine Show.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, it's a real honor to be here, man. I love your show.
I appreciate that, and I love your work. And I know we had a little chat a while ago about your work, but and I want to get into Pineapple Express and the book and everything you're doing now with your nonprofit. But you're a special forces guy, so warriors at heart. But I always start these shows by getting a sense of like who's the man before or the woman before they became the courageous warrior that happened to be on the Mark Divine Show, right? As the latest courageous warrior that we're out there chatting at, because we all have a unique origin story and the trials and tribulations and the hero's journey that kind of led us to where we're at. So what's yours? Where's
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's one of the many things you and I have in common is a love of storytelling. And for me, I wanted to be a Green Beret from the time I was 14 years old. It was a very, very early thing for me. And it was because I grew up in a little logging town in Mount Ida, Arkansas. I think my graduating class was something like 36 people. And and one day a Green Beret named Mark came into our town, walked into our soda shop, and just the way the guy looked, he had his dress uniform on. It just, for me, was a true game-changing moment. And I didn't even know what the guy did, but I was super, super small, Mark. I mean, I was a runt. I was, pretty bullied as a kid. I moved around a lot and was kind of always on the outside looking in. And there was just something about this guy and the way that he conducted himself, the way that he carried himself that just spoke to me as that's what I wanted to be. And then when I sat down with him though, and that was probably the coolest thing, was that he actually took the time to sit down and talk to me, at 14.
Yeah. Was he there on like a recruiting thing or what?
He was there on leave. His dad actually owned the soda shop and he was there on leave. Nice. And, it was a pretty novel thing in a little town like that. Anytime a stranger came in town, but to see somebody this guy's caliber and the way he carried himself, and you could just tell there was something special about him. Mm-hmm. But it was really when he sat down with me, and I just felt like the guy saw me. I felt like it was one of those rare moments as a child that I was seen by an adult for what I could be.
That's cool.
And it was cool, and I try to never forget that. Whenever a young person comes up to me and asks me about special ops or special forces, I try to, go back to that time when I was so enamored with Mark. But when he explained to me, Mark, what they did as far as working by, with, and through indigenous cultures and kind of helping the little guy stand up against the big guy, that whole Lawrence of Arabia thing, just, man, it spoke to me. And so from that point on, I started preparing training. I probably watched John Wayne, Green Berets, and Rambo 1,000 times, and just never looked back. I went into the Army as a second lieutenant and ultimately tried out for SF. I think I probably recycled Ranger School and selection, more times than anyone in modern history.
Really?
Yeah. But I finally
you weren't going to quit though. You weren't.
No, I finally made it. And, it was just the most amazing ride. I got to, I'm sure you would agree, it was the guys that I got to hang out with. It was the guys that I got to be around, and just say that I was around them was the most meaningful, powerful thing in my life, was to run the miles with those guys. Even to this day, I'm still in awe that I got to hang out with those guys.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. And I think that's one of the really unique aspects of special forces, regardless of which branch you're in. Yeah. We have that camaraderie and that depth of love for your teammates, which is just so rare.
Yeah.
It's one of the things I'm trying to give people a taste of through SEALFIT, but it's so rare and it's so necessary. People crave that.
They're hungry for it.
They're hungry for that.
Yeah.
What can you say about the very famous Q course that beyond a shadow of a doubt changed you? Like you were one way before you went in, and you were different as a result of that training.
Well, what a great question. I would say the number one thing that changed me in that Q course was the validation of engagement and relationships. In the final part that they call Robin Sage.
Right.
which is really the world's largest.
It's a simulation, right? That's the unconventional warfare.
Yeah, it's an unconventional warfare simulation. It spans 5 counties and generations of role players going all the way back to like 1952.
No shit.
Yeah,
Holy
man.
cow.
I mean, like it's like there would be a grandfather out there, dropping off 4 harvested deer to the guerrilla force with his grandson. And he's completely in character. He owns the farm. You'd have a Subway shop owner driving a cattle truck to deliver guerrillas to a drop-off point. Like the whole part of North Carolina is in on it. And, cool. That for me was, I've always valued human connection and storytelling and relationships and that kind of thing because I'm a child of Appalachia. But seeing that in real time and seeing the amount of effort that the Q course put into this, I thought, my God. And then fast forward, some years later, not too long after the war on terror started up, and, I got into Afghanistan and I was talking to some young team leaders and captains about what life was like out in the villages for them. And they said, just like Robin Sage, sir.
No kidding.
And I was like, wow, that was pretty powerful.
That is cool. What was, everyone wants to think about hard, like Navy SEAL training is the hardest, or is it Rangers or Green Beret? What was hard about selection in the Q course for you and for others?
Yeah, I think for me, I was not great at land navigation. Mm-hmm. And I was pretty small.
I would put myself in that category too, by the way. I got some funny stories there. Navy SEALs were supposed to be good underwater, not necessarily on the land.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I got good at it because I had some great NCOs that were like, Jesus, sir, come here. Like, but when I wasn't really great at it going in, and I failed this thing that's called SF stakes. I know you guys have something like it when you go through, but it's basically where you do these long movements, on your own. And what I found was I'd already failed it once. No, man, I failed it twice. So I was on my
clean here.
I was on my third movement, my third time, and that was it. They made it super clear to me. Did you fail this one? You're going back to where you came from, and being alone in the Pisgah National Forest with just my rucksack and my thoughts, and really the self-sabotage that was coming forward and telling me, dude, you're not cut out for this. This is not what you should be doing. And the head chatter that was going on, and trying to find a way to tell myself a different story and quiet that was one of the hardest things I ever did. And it served me more in combat than any tactic I ever learned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe it. Yeah, controlling that inner voice, feeding the courage wolf instead of letting that fear wolf kind of drive your thoughts.
Such a great metaphor.
That's funny because in SQT, which is after Buds, we did a land nav that was similar to that. And this is when you're at SQT, even though we didn't have our trident back in that day. SQT now is wrapped into Buds, and you get your trident at the end of it all. For us, we would get. We graduated Buds and we got our trident. Then we went to the SEALs. So we actually got our trident. No, let me back up. I'm mixing this up. We didn't get our trident. We had to go to the team. Then we went through STT, SEAL Tactical Training, which is, became SQT. And then after that 4-month thing, then you had a board, and, you had to go through all the PQS, and then, they could still kick you out.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we had to pass was our version of that, right? We did our thing in Buds, but this is our version in SQT. And we jumped into an Army base, which really well, up at Fort Lewis in Washington. And it's pretty thick up there. And
that's tough terrain.
Jumped in, no comms with anyone else. We had to then find our first site. And yours truly, literally, I don't not know to this day how I could possibly fuck up this badly, but I had my compass upside down and I was following the complete opposite bearing from where I was supposed to go.
I love it.
And I'm just like cruising, thinking I'm doing great. I find myself, I'm going over like fences and I'm seeing all this civilian shit. I'm like, damn, I think I'm off base. Like I'm doing something wrong. So I figured it out. Yeah. I literally, like a Navy SEAL would, I ran back on that bearing as best I could, and I found the drop zone.
Oh my God.
And then I started off on the right bearing. I started over, and now it's like 4 a.m. It's raining like shit, and I'm thinking there's no way I'm going to make this this
Yeah.
point. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I just sat down. I did what I knew how to do, which is just sit and do nothing. And I learned that by meditating, before I
Yeah.
joined the SEALs. Like, maybe if I just sit here and meditate, some answer will come to me. And
Wow.
it was kind of like praying. So I'm sitting there and I'm just kind of scanning the forest, kind of wondering what's going to happen, what I'm going to do. Maybe this is the end. And I'm looking in the distance and I see something that just looks a little out of place, like this marking on this tree, this coloring, And so I was like, So I just got my gear and I'm just soaking, drenched, walked over. It's about 5 minutes away. I walked over to this spot and I look up and the first thing in my head was like, God bless the Army, because on that tree was a sign that had a grid coordinate on it. I kid you not.
Unbelievable, man.
Unbelievable. I'm like, okay, well, there I am. From there, I can find the point.
Wow. And so what was your, like, and so you were totally, like, literally in that moment, totally lost. And so what was like your final, when you look back on that now, like, what would you say is the biggest takeaway from that moment for you?
Well, it's a great question. For me, kind of like what you were saying, is managing my emotions and the mental chatter. If I had been like beating the crap out of myself, I would have been toast, right? I never would have seen that sign.
Yeah.
But I learned that, and I learned this so many times, that if you just relax and kind of surrender to the moment and open yourself up to possibilities, then usually the answer is right in front of your face.
Yeah.
Or it's handed to you in some synchronicity moment. I bet you had those moments in combat. I had several of them, which literally saved my life.
Yeah.
This one wasn't a lifesaver, but it was more, it helped me to realize that, just pushing through and doing. And, if I had tried to just rush toward where I thought the point would be, I would have missed it. Right.
Yeah.
So sometimes just pausing and doing nothing is essential.
And listening for that moment. It taught you to listen for that moment,
Right.
And that's so true. And I think, to your point, there were definitely times in combat and in higher stakes situations where I had to do a version of that, but it was learning that in training. Mm-hmm. And just fucking up and learning that even in the worst mistakes, if you don't quit on yourself, there's a pathway out of it. And
always
for me,
a pathway. And that's what the instructors are looking for. They're looking for good decision making, not flailing, right? We try to teach that in our SEAL Fit. It's like pause, breathe, think this through using all your resources, not just your linear rational brain. Think it through, and then act. So PBTA is the acronym. And I think that was an early version where I had started to learn that. And I didn't actually get to the point exactly on time. I was a little late, but when in the debrief, we talked, I told them the story and the instructors just would laugh their asses off. A, that the army would put the grid coordinates on the tree, and B, that I was that lucky or that dumb enough to be that lucky, which wasn't that dumb. It was actually kind of smart.
Yeah, like I want that guy in my platoon, man. That dude's lucky.
That guy's a lucky one. Yeah, we won. Okay, so after a Q course, you put on the Green Beret, and what was your career like there?
Well, I went into 7th Special Forces Group, and I think the SEALs do this now, East Coast, West Coast. You all apportion and align to certain parts of the world. At least you try to. SF has been doing that a long time. And so I had already served in Panama and when I was a lieutenant, and I loved it. I loved Latin America. I met a lot of 7th Group guys, a lot of 7th Group NCOs, and I was very enamored with the mission, with the way those NCOs carried themselves. And so I was assigned to 7th Group at Fort Bragg, and that was in the 90s, where the bulk of my junior officer time was in the drug war in the Andean Ridge, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, that kind of thing. And I loved it. I just absolutely loved it.
What were those missions like?
Well, there was it depended on where you were, but mostly it was mostly combat advisor by, with, and through kind of stuff where, you could get out and you could do some things with the partner force, the Commandos, the Lanceros, but it was very much with them in the lead. And, you were truly an advisor, and you had to really play it that way. And, but what was great about it, Mark, for me, was that you had zero authority over these individuals. You had very little resources. What you had was your your mindset, your skill set, and your relationships, really.
Right.
And that's what you brought to the table. And some damn good NCOs, and who these guys had known since they were privates, and who they respected. And I got to walk missions and do missions with these SF NCOs who were just iconic. And they were like, they could walk into, like the Joint Chiefs office in the Colombian Pentagon, put their feet up on the desk and have a conversation with the Colombian Chief of Staff. Like they'd known this guy, like he was talking to a lieutenant, and not in a disrespectful way, but in a way that they had run the miles together. And man, I fell in love with that. I fell in love with that idea that a segment of our special ops population could have that kind of relationship cred in times of duress with partners. And I stayed there and did that couple of commands until 9/11 happened, and then we completely reoriented on Southwest Asia and Afghanistan.
Right. Yeah, back to that point, I think that is one of the coolest things. And this is why, like in the SEALs, we're such a small force.
Yeah.
It was pretty routine for, for like like when I was over in Iraq, Commander Wilson, he would grab an E4, E5, most SEALs are E5 or above.
Yeah.
And, send him into town and put a pair of lieutenant bars on him.
Yeah.
He didn't promote him. He just says, wear these, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Cause they could carry their own. But then, when the guys got really deep in, of course they didn't need to do that. And it was all about the relationships and the trust that was built. And, actually this is kind of like what makes the story of Afghanistan and what happened and what you wrote about so terrible for the special ops, because we had like genuine relationships built that and built on trust and promises that didn't
there's
quite pan out.
There's something I say in the book in Pineapple Express that there's a promise that we make as special operators to each other and to our partners, which is, I have your back.
That's right.
And sometimes it's explicit and sometimes it's implicit, but it's always there. And I know that you saw this in Iraq, Mark, but we spent the bulk of our youth honoring that promise. We spent the bulk of and I would say, I can tell you, I'm here because of the actions of several partners who stepped into the breach and did some things they didn't have to do. And so, it's a reciprocal relationship. And I am in awe, honestly, at institutional leaders who scratch their heads and go, what's the big deal? Like, why is everybody so up in arms over this? And I just, to me, it's unfathomable that after expecting our special ops community to build the levels of partnership that we did in this war on terror for 2 decades, and looking at how we were struck on 9/11 because of an absence of partnership, to be an antibody to Al-Qaeda, like how in the world we could expect anything other than what these special ops volunteers did is beyond me.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll come back to that. I'm in agreement. And we have to deal with that, right? Because, we're not ultimately in charge.
Yeah.
We're following orders and we have to kind of do what the big man says. But let's talk about your initial foray into Afghanistan. I have read stories about the Green Berets and the guys who worked with the Northern Alliance, riding right around on horseback. It really was kind of Lawrence of Arabia type stuff, like back to the roots of what you've always done. Now you say you've been doing it and training it with Robert Sage and everything, but typically those are with countries that we've been in for a long period of time. And now suddenly you're parachuting into hostile territory and trying to make friends with people that you don't even know if they're supposed to be your friends or are willing to be your friends. You don't know who to trust. So what was that like?
Well, I was not on the initial group that went in. That was 5th group, but I've done a lot of work in that space, talking to those guys and capturing lessons learned. And, what I can tell you is that from an institutional memory perspective, what came out of that, where the quote unquote horse soldiers went in and, made those connections, even in the beginning when they went in, they didn't have really any pre-existing relationships with Afghans. And I think that's really important to note, particularly where we are right now in the world. But, when the Afghan embassy fell in, I think it was 1978, and then the Soviets came in, and then you had the agency working, basically with the Northern Alliance and others through Pakistan. So there wasn't a ton of direct engagement, and if it was agency. There was no SF involvement in that country for decades, and then you had the Civil War, and then you had the Taliban. So by the time Fifth Group rolled in, man, there was no pre-existing relationship with the Northern Alliance. So these guys actually worked with pilot teams from the agency who brought operators out of retirement who had worked with the Northern Alliance years back. And the Jawbreaker teams consisted of at least some guys who were the only guys who had that relationship. I tell you all that because, relationships over the long term in SF, special ops, hell, business, organizational relationships are so important. And when you don't have them as they're handed off from one operator to the next or one detachment to the next, and you have to roll in blind and establish relationships when risk is high, it is not the same thing. It is not the same thing, and you better bring a lot of cash.
Yeah,
which they did.
That's interesting. So yeah. So we go in there, and we fortunately we had some relationships, but we did also bring a lot of cash, like you said, lots of it, palletfuls of cash.
Yeah,
and that's cash can only buy you so much trust.
That's right.
So the trust is built one day at a time by basically saying, we're going to do this for you, and then doing that for them.
Yeah.
And then rinse and repeat, and the doing of that is not necessarily, like what people most think of special ops as doing. It's like, helping to set up the school and getting the water, healthy or building a well or whatever, So what were the things that Seventh Group did that, were like, develop those trust relationships mostly, besides going down and chasing down the bad guys?
Well, look, I will tell you that for the first 10 years of the war, I think it's a fair statement to say that most of the special forces and special operations counterinsurgency engagements on the non-kinetic side were generally oriented on getting after targets. In other words, I might do a medical treatment thing, but in doing so, I'm looking for information on bad guys while I'm doing it, right? So it was always with a kind of tongue-in-cheek, we're going to try to get it.
Battlefield and getting the intel. Yeah,
absolutely.
Interesting.
But in 2009, the Special Forces community made a major pivot in how we were engaging, and we really got away from. We had very much kind of taken on a direct action role and really kind of gotten away from the by, with, and through Lawrenceian approach, and so we got back to that, and we did a program called Village Stability Operations. I wrote a book about it called Game Changers, but think of it as like a modern day Magnificent Seven. The SEALs did a good bit of it in Zabul province as well. But basically what it was moving into these communities and literally working alongside the villagers, growing out the beards, living in the community. And what I would say there, Mark, is in all the time that I spent in Afghanistan, I found that to be the most profound, impactful experience, in that living and working alongside these villagers, these Afghan special forces in the day-to-day life, getting to know their sources of instability around low-tech agriculture, getting to understand the issues they had with dispute resolution and tribal dynamics. Like, I think if I could summarize it, it is really everything in life comes down to what's local. Like people's local context. And unless you can relate to their pain and be relevant to their goals, it's really hard to get them to move to take action in a meaningful way. So I would say those were the things that we did, but it took us 10 years to figure it out. It was really too late at that point. So the program only lasted for a couple of years. It was very impactful, but then we kind of reset and went back to the top-down kinetic approach. But I saw that to be the most, and I found it. That's what I actually teach here in the civilian world is that local human connection approach in the day-to-day is where you can really achieve strategic impacts.
Why did it go back to the kinetic? Was that just change in leadership that said, okay, we got to go back and play whack-a-mole?
Well, it did, and there was some politics involved on the Afghan side. President Karzai did not really like special forces teams being down in the tribal village level. He had some concerns with that because he was obviously dabbling in that arena, so he didn't like SF guys being there. There were comments made to the National Command Authority here in the United States about it, and so there was a lot of pressure from the Afghan government because it made them very nervous with SF guys and teams being down there at the tribal level. Very effective against the Taliban.
Might actually figure out what's going on.
we might actually win.
Right,
yeah, exactly. And we might actually empower local communities to stand up on their own, which is, if you look at Afghanistan's history, in their longest running period of stability, which was the Musahiban dynasty from the 1920s to the 1970s, it was a period of time where communities were very autonomous, very empowered, and shared a relationship with the government on civil society. And that's what we saw. We started to get back to. They loved it, but it made a lot of autocrats very nervous.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So let's kind of pivot and talk a little bit now toward the end, right? So the Taliban are starting to, let me ask you this way. How did the Taliban kind of reconstitute their power? Was it because we kept pulling back and, we weren't doing as much work? I mean, what was it that led to the Taliban to gain all their power back and set themselves up to do what happened in the end?
I think the first thing we have to consider is that the Taliban mounted what is a rural insurgency. That's the first thing that we have to understand, is that the nature of the insurgency was a rural insurgency. So the power base was in the rural areas, not the urban areas. The prize was the urban areas, right? Kabul, Kandahar, but the actual source of power was out in the rural areas where, if you go any direction in Afghanistan, this is probably true in Iraq as well, if you go a kilometer off the pavement, you've really exceeded the reach of the central government, right? So now in that realm, it is a bottom-up status tribal society that handles its own affairs largely. And what had happened was the Soviets had decimated that rural system in the 70s and 80s. They had killed off most of the elders. Then you had the Civil War. Then you had the Taliban. So there was a complete just destruction of Afghan civil society in these rural areas. The Taliban knew that. We focused all our effort on the urban areas, right? We put all our people there. Mm-hmm. So they understood that if the Taliban could set up shop in these outlying villages and co-opt the rural Afghans to their narrative, then by the time we started in the cities and got to the villages, they would start in the villages and they would be at the gates of the city. And that's exactly what happened with the fall of Kabul. They mounted a patient, multi-generational rural insurgency, and they bled us dry.
That makes sense. So I don't have all the details straight in my head, but if I recall, when Trump was in office, there was some discussion that, hey, we've been at this for 20 years. We're probably not going to be at this forever. So we're going to figure out how to draw down and kind of turn this thing over. We're working on turning it over or creating some sort of partnership relationship with the Taliban. A lot of skepticism that would have been effective, right? Any kind of partnership with the government. And we knew the Taliban wanted to take it over, but what do you think that would have worked? Do you think there was a better, what was the path in your opinion that would had the best chance of success?
Yeah, look, I think that it is totally understandable that both administrations or both sides of the political aisle and a large segment of the American people looked at this 20-year war and said, what are we still doing there? Why are we still there? Why are we involved in this? And I don't think that the senior military leadership and even guys that operated at my level did a good job of explaining the real nature of this war, and the fact that what we were really doing there was capacity building, a ground intelligence capability, and a partner force that was capable of being an antibody to strategic violent extremism, right? That was ultimately where this thing was heading. Was we had built a commando force, an Afghan special forces capability, even an Air Force of special mission wing pilots who they were doing a damn good job of keeping the Taliban off balance. They were carrying 90%, 98% of the combat load. 66,000 Afghans were killed in combat. Like there was a sizable partnership underway, but you're talking about the Army only had been in existence for 19 years. I mean, most 19-year-olds, as my friend Jason Houck says, how competent are they? And yet we had this fledgling Army that like there was no way it was ready to be unilateral. So I think what happened was we built this Army in our own image. We built it to be highly technical, highly reliant on optics and platforms and contractors. And it was a preferred Western approach that we had. And the reality was it required us to be, on station, to be at their shoulder, to continue to advise them. And when President Trump made the decision to deal directly with the Taliban and leave out the Afghan government, I think the fix was in at that point. It completely obviated the Afghan government. It cut their knees out and it made them irrelevant. And frankly, their willingness to, I think, serve as a partner to us was severely damaged. And then when the coup de grace was President Biden after that, following through on that plan and pulling the contractor support out without warning in June. It left the Air Force unable to fly. And, it was just a series of those kind of things on both sides of the political aisle, uninformed policy decisions that left us in a place where the house of cards ultimately just fell.
Collapsed. Yeah, one thing I do want to say, regardless of, I recognize that was a tricky problem, and you would have had to have a whole different story to like reinvigorate a new strategy, of sustainment and maybe capacity building. The story that would have inspired me, and I think Americans, is what we did for the women of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
An entire generation of women tasting freedom, tasting education, tasting soccer for the first time and being able to participate as, not 100%, but, beginning to the early spring of being, equals. And that freaking door, nobody talked about that.
Right.
That wasn't, a strategic initiative, but I swear to God, I think our country and our world, just like we see in Ukraine, people said, let's go Ukraine. They would have said, let's go women of Afghanistan. It's worth, keeping 3,000, troops. And by the way, our NATO allies would have probably just jumped on that one too. Right.
Yeah.
We're talking about half the population of the world who would have backed that. You know what I mean? At least more than that.
Yeah. And, it's one of the things I talk about in the book is that it was very disappointing when all of this happened and the collapse happened. There was a real opportunity, I think, to double down and stand up for at-risk women. I mean, there were, for example, the Minister of Women's Affairs, Hasina Safi, was on the run and asking for help, and ended up coming out through, the Pineapple Express because there was no government entity to get her out. This was the Minister for Women's Affairs, represented everything you just said.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about the fall and, kind of what people have equated to like the fall of Saigon, this completely, this mess, right? This suddenly like we jerked everyone out, didn't have the support. Now everyone's, trying to get to the airport in Kabul. What a disaster. What was that? Were you there at that time or you?
No. I was never on the ground. Our approach with Pineapple was a remote approach, Mark, where we worked, just leveraged relationships and the Signal app on our cell phones to basically be the eyes and ears of our partners and help them, present them responsibly to the men and women on that gate so that they knew they were looking at highly vetted individuals that were, at risk. That was our job. And that's how we came at it. So when the collapse started to happen, really for me, it was one individual, Nizam, who was a former Afghan Commando and Special Forces NCO who was in duress. And, there were several of us trying to help him. And, it was one of those things where, like, I didn't want to get involved in Afghanistan again, to be honest with you. I've been out for 10 years. I retired from my time in the Army because things were going in a direction I didn't agree with. So I left. And so to get back into that was not what I wanted to do. But man, it was complete chaos. I'm telling you, it was one province at a time, falling very rapidly. And it was in a free fall. And, our friends like Nizam were in complete duress. They had no options. They had no way out. And for me, looking at him going through that and not surviving, it was like everything that had happened in that country over 20 years was all kind of resting on whether he lived or died. And that's, I think, for most people who got involved, that's what it was. It was a personal connection to an individual or individuals that we felt obligated to because of our partnership relationship over all those years.
Right. How many people do you think your organization, which wasn't an organization at that time, but it's become, how many people do you think your network and others really helped get out?
Yeah. And that's a great point you make, is that, like, all of these groups, like Dunkirk and Sacred Promise and Moral Compass and Pineapple, they all come across as if they were like these task forces, but in reality, they weren't. It was a bunch of
guys that using the Signal app, right?
It's a bunch of retired old farts, like trying to do what they can. And, as my buddy Duke says, it was, trying to solve an Uncle Sam sized problem with our pension funds. It was just way, way out over our skis, but it was a group of volunteers, both active duty and veterans, who formed these ad hoc signal rooms, basically. And it was very, very spontaneous. It was a self-organizing system in many ways, Mark. And it was all around this notion of honoring a promise. It was all around this notion of just connecting and staying and trying to help our friends. And it grew. And it grew and it grew until the ISIS-K explosion on at the end of August, and that shut everything down. Really, I mean, the efforts are still underway to this day. There are still volunteer groups who are still actively trying to get allies out of there, but it has become almost impossible.
Really?
Yeah.
Why did the explosion shut it down? Was it our government that said don't do that anymore? It's too dangerous, or?
Yeah, I mean, because the NEO, or the non-combatant evacuation that was spearheaded by the 82nd, was already wrapping up. So we knew that somewhere around the 31st of August, the last plane was going to leave Afghanistan.
So you were just trying to get people vetted to be on those planes. Once the last plane left, there's really not much you can do unless you were to fly over there yourselves. And there's no way to get into the country. There's no
right. And guys like Glenn Beck and others sponsored these massive airlifts that happened, and that was great. But I mean, we were kind of just taking it one thing at a time, which was how many can we get out now? And before they leave. And then the other ticking clock was, a lot of people knew that there was an ISIS-K bomber, floating, and it was that this was an emerging threat, that people were talking about it. The Taliban were even talking about it. So it became two ticking clocks. You had the 31 August deadline, and then you had this unknown bomb threat that was lurking around Abbey Gate. So it became kind of this frantic push to get as many people out as possible. I would estimate, and this is an estimate, that somewhere around 750 at-risk Afghans were evacuated with Pineapple connections and direct involvement before the explosion, and then all told, maybe 1,000. After that, several weeks after that, we were able to over time get several hundred out. But there were thousands and thousands left behind, that we were unable to affect.
And what do you think their fate is right now? Are they able to assimilate and kind of go to ground, or are they known entities where their lives were at risk?
It's a great question. I think the Commandos and the Afghan Special Operations Forces are severely at risk. And, that's being borne out in so many ways. They're being hunted and targeted by the Taliban, by the Haqqani network. One of my fears is that they're starting to be co-opted by Iran, Pakistan, ISIS, and co-opted for use as potential terror opportunities, or even fighting in Ukraine.
Right.
Which is a huge problem.
It is a big problem. Why is this such a big deal to you beyond, the code? I mean, what other meaning does this have to us as a nation, do you think?
Well, I think for me, it's about it's about national security. I think
right.
the veteran population that is involved with this and that is upset about this, and we're talking about like 73% of the veteran population feels betrayed by this. I think the reason that the veteran population is so upset about this is because they recognize that, one, if we're going to deal with near-peer threats like Iran and Russia, or we're going to deal with Al-Qaeda or ISIS, it's not going to be unilaterally. We're going to be dealing with surrogates. We're going to work with partners. And right now, our partnership cred is shit, and it goes all the way back to the Montagnards in Vietnam, the Kurds in Syria, the Iraqi police, the Iraqi military, and now the Afghan military and police have all been left by this just systemic abandonment, this wholesale abandonment that we tend to do when, policy conflicts start to happen. And so our young Green Berets, our young SEALs, we have really put them in a tenuous position to go do partnership work around the world. And I worry about that. And I think a lot of veterans do. But then also I think that Afghanistan has become a playground. Al-Qaeda is reconstituting right now. Bin Laden's son, Zawahiri's son-in-law are in Afghanistan. ISIS has moved their flag from Syria to Afghanistan. And now we have evidence that the Iranians and the Russians are recruiting commandos to go fight in Ukraine. I mean,
people that we've trained. Yeah.
These are our partners that are being mobilized, co-opted. And so it does represent, and I think that more than anything, after fighting and bleeding for a partner force for 20 years because of what happened on 9/11, and then to literally turn the page on it and be stuck back in that again it's hard. It doesn't sit well with veterans. And I think that's why they're so involved in this.
Yeah. Last time we spoke, you made a comment to me, which kind of not resonated, but kind of struck me as like, where were all the senior officers?
Yep.
Where was their voice? Because the people speaking out about this and saying, hey, this is wrong, were like mostly NCOs and JOs.
Yeah.
Right? You didn't hear a peep from the generals.
No, man, it's such a good comment, Mark. I mean, look at the public space right now. Like, just look at the public space, and you really don't see very many active or former flag officers or senior enlisted advisors talking about, accountability of this thing. We've had one public hearing in Congress. I mean, are you kidding me? There's not a lot of conversation around the moral injury and the mental health tsunami that I think we're on the front end of right now, that we're probably going to feel. And I interviewed dozens and dozens of really iconic special operators who spent years on the teams and years in the groups and the ODAs, and they're all saying the same thing. Where are the generals? Like, where are they right now? If we don't, set politics aside, set accountability aside, but how do we move forward from here? I think we really need senior leaders to step into the space, even if it's former senior leaders, and start to give us their words of wisdom and their leadership on how we move forward from here as an institution. Because this has had if you look at recruiting, look at retention, public trust in the military dropped 11 points since August. 81% spike in calls to the VA hotline. I mean, this isn't, the numbers bear this out. So I really am looking for, I think, more overt leadership from our senior officers right now.
Well, I think that my personal view on that is that kind of what we've seen happening in the last couple of years with the pandemic and the silencing of any kind of dissenting opinion toward, vaccine safety and all these things, the censorship, cancel culture, all of that insidiousness has put a lot of fear into people who formerly would have felt like they have a platform or the capacity to step out. And so it just shows you that,
Yeah.
what can happen when you start to have these kind of totalitarian tendencies.
Yeah.
The courageous ones don't always, step up and speak out against it because they don't want to be the next one decapitated.
I've heard, I can't tell you how many people I've heard, like GOs and flag officers, say, Scott, like, I can't get involved in this. I mean, I appreciate what you're doing, but, I have to stay in the shadows on this. I'm like, okay.
It's kind of fucked up, isn't it?
It is. I think it is.
It's a really slippery slope, in my opinion.
I've even had, I'll tell you this, between, just on this call, I've had very, very highly placed officers in the military whose PAOs and others and handlers have said to me, the slippery slope going the other way. Like, because I've said, a lot of people in the veteran community are disillusioned with the leadership, and they are wondering why no one resigned, and I had the slippery slope thing thrown back at me. Like, do you want generals and admirals resigning when they disagree with leadership? And I'm like, when it's immoral, yes, I do, that's my personal opinion. But I think a lot of individuals feel like this was just egregious, and the page has just been turned, and it's just like, just move on. And I don't think, particularly when you consider the fact that Afghanistan could very easily follow us home. What comes out of this, the shadow on this administration, and frankly, the administration before it, might not be the abandonment, but rather the cataclysmic attack that follows on the homeland as a result of the safe haven that was re-empowered. And I think veterans get that, and they understand that, and they're not good with that.
Right. It's what's considered a wicked problem.
It is a wicked problem indeed.
It's a wicked problem that doesn't have any
ill-structured.
answer.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, no, it really does. And I just think that the key is we got to communicate with each other. We got to talk to each other. We got to take care of each other. We need to, I think, pay attention to our veterans who are the moral compass of this nation. I think what they're talking about in terms of the Afghan problem and the mental health issues and all that goes with it. We need to hear them, because this systemic habit of abandonment has got to stop if we're going to continue to be relevant in the world.
Yeah. It's a great place to put a pin in it. So your book, Operation Pineapple Express, I saw that you were a New York Times bestseller already.
Yeah.
You just released it. Yeah. Congratulations. Yeah. That's phenomenal.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. And thanks for giving us a voice.
I'm happy that they gave you the attention.
I was surprised. I really was surprised. And I think what it shows is that a lot of Americans do care about this, and they understand that, what I would leave people with too is that there's a lot of pain around this, but there's also a lot of pride in the fact that our veterans and other volunteers, when they saw that nobody else was coming, they stepped into the arena and they led, and they showed us what leadership looks like. And at that moment, that was their Pineapple Express. And I think we're in a place in this country where we need leaders, civilians, to do the same thing. That's what's your Pineapple Express, and step in there and lead, even when you don't know how it's going to go, or if you don't have a title, because that's, I think, what might pull the country back.
I agree. And that's why we and our teammates are doing what we do, right? We can show through our example and through our teachings, that there is a way to lead with courage, lead with an open heart, not a fist, open hand and open heart, not a fist. And also to be accountable to our actions, and to admit that we don't have all the answers, but, we're going to together, figure things out, a better path forward.
Yeah.
It's very 100%. Different than the type of leadership we've been, exhibited in the boardroom and in the political offices. And I think that people are kind of done with that. So they're looking for other options.
They are. So, bottom-up leadership and grassroots leadership is, and there is Robert Putnam wrote a wonderful book called The Upswing that talks about in the early 1900s when Americans, did a very similar thing to what you're doing, Mark, with what you're building with your community, and where leaders just said, you know what, nobody's going to get me sober. Let's have a meeting. And they called it Alcoholics Anonymous, and the Rotary Club and the Junior League, and really all of the organizations of social capital that we grew up with as kids were started in the early 1900s as an unprecedented movement of bottom-up leadership. So there's actually a macro level precedent for that in our country. And Putnam believes, and I do too, that we are on the precipice of another upswing. In fact, I think Pineapple and Dunkirk and all these things that happened and what you're building is kind of that first shot across the bow of Americans stepping back and taking their country back. And I think we can.
I agree. Awesome. Well, thanks again, Scott, for your time. Thanks for your service, both in and out of uniform. And Pineapple Express, you can find that wherever books are. Where can people find you and learn more about your work?
Yeah, thanks. If you go to scottmann.com, 2 N's, all of my body of work is there. The nonprofit, our play, Last Out, all of the work that we're doing with Afghanistan, ways to get the book. Yeah, absolutely. Scottmann.com has all of it there, and would love people to check it out.
Awesome. And social media, anything there that you know people can hashtag you and find you and follow you?
Yeah, pretty much anything. I think Scott Mann is my handles on all of it, or Rooftop Leader, and I'll shoot those over to you as well.
Rooftop Leader. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, Scott. Hoo-yah. Stay focused and stay safe and keep charging.
All right.
Lead
Thanks
the
so
way.
much, Mark.
Rangers lead the way. What do special forces do?
De oppresso libera, free the oppressed.
Free the oppressed. There you go. Well, okay. Well, you're doing a good job of that.
Right on, brother. Thank you, man.
Take care.